Hello, I'm your host Peter Sawchuk, a professor of adult education and workplace learning at the University of Toronto. You're listening to Work, Learning, and Social Change Foundational Voices, an informal discussion with some of the figures who have helped to define the field. In this episode, I'm speaking to Victoria Marsick, Professor of Adult Learning and Leadership at the Columbia University Teachers College in New York City. With work spanning over 4 decades, she is known for her profound contributions to studies of learning and work, the importance of context, and the hidden or undiscussable aspects of human experience and development. Welcome and hello, everybody out there. Our discussion series is meant to be informal, but let me give you a few prepared remarks by way of introduction to our special guest here. In a lengthy and extraordinary set of careers within and outside academia, over the course of 4 decades, Victoria Marsick has become known for her contributions to studies of learning, work, organizations, as well as human resource development, with special attention to advancing theories of informal and incidental, as well as individual, team-based, and organizational learning. In some of her most recent work, she and colleagues begin to fill out the meaning and the possibilities of something called learning-based work as distinct from work-based learning. Prior to academia, she worked as an educational consultant around the world, as well as with staff development and training for UNICEF. In her academic career, she has attracted a raft of professional awards and distinctions, including being recognized as Scholar of the Year by the Academy of Human Resource Development, as well as being inducted into the International Adult and Continuing Education Hall of Fame. Well, I came to know her first through her 1987 book as a doctoral student, Learning in the Workplace, and her early contributions with her colleague Karen Watkins, who she keeps up with. In fact, Victoria has authored, co-authored, edited, co-edited an astounding number and continuing stream of scholarly and applied applications. Throughout it all, it is evident that she's never lost sight of how sophisticated research on work and learning can, should, and must be in direct contact with practice and the efforts of real-world change in organizational life. Victoria, welcome. It's wonderful to meet you face-to-face for the first time for me. And thanks for taking the time to contribute to this discussion series. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And I hope you're well too. And it really is my pleasure. I enjoy your work as well. And it's always good to be able to talk scholar to scholar and person to person, colleague to colleague. So thank you.
Yeah, isn't it though? Yeah, I love it. I'll just jump into my first questions. It's an oddly phrased question, but it seems to work well with people, the kind of senior scholars like yourself. Many people around the world have read your work, cited your work. I was mentioning to you before we started recording, teaching your work. And they've, by definition, they supply their own interpretations of your work. But I'm interested, because I've had the experience myself of characterizing my own work every once in a while. And it's always just a little different from how other people characterize it and kind of think of it. They never quite think of it exactly the same way I do. So I was just wondering, basically, what are your own impressions of your own work, your own approach to research, how it's maybe evolved? What do you think are its core concerns? Have these remained? What are its principles? What makes it distinct, do you think?
Well, that is a good question. And I appreciate your sending me the questions in advance to kind of think about. So last night I was just kind of going back. I'm a bit of an introvert, and so I need to kind of gather my thoughts sometimes before I talk. And, it was interesting to go back and to try to answer that question, because I don't think that's something we think about. We're just working, right? We're just doing what we're doing. And we never stop to really think about, well, what is this body of work, about? It's sort of taken for granted, which is really kind of the stuff I'm interested in, is the stuff that's taken for granted and the stuff that really influences us without our really being able to understand that it influences us. And I go back to, I'm the basis of my work is really learning from experience. And of course, that's not simple. We know it sounds simple, but it isn't. And neuroscience is helping us to understand how even less simple it is than we thought it might have been.
Right.
But it, in some ways, Jack Mesro introduced me to this, to a lot of the work on life history and on biography. And that's very influential in how I think and how I work and how I think about my work. because it is learning from experience. And I realize very much that my own experience influences the lens that I bring to what I'm seeing and where things are. And I grew up in a place called Cleveland, Ohio. I don't know if you've ever been to Cleveland.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, at that time, industrial heartland. Now, of course, without the industrial basic industries, it's a different place, I think. But in Cleveland, it is in some ways a representation of many diverse groups of people, and yet the boundaries between each of these groups of people were just so great. So I'm a Czechoslovakian by background. I've never been to Czechoslovakia. One of the things I hope I can do in my lifetime on that bucket list. But in the Czechoslovakians, in the small area that I lived, there were Czechoslovakians, but we lived in certain areas. Slovakians were kind of like neighbors, not the same, but you know, we had some there was a Hungarian neighborhood, and the Italians, oh my goodness, you should stay away from the Italians, they said, you know. So, but each one had their little areas. And I would always speculate on, you know, the name Cleveland. In some ways, the word cleave is bring together, and it's also separate. And I felt that tension, I think, as I grew up, of being in Cleveland and being in a cleaved land. And so I think that's influenced a lot of my work, because as I grew up, there were things that just weren't said. There was a lot of undiscussables in the family. Probably most families have them, right? But Eastern Europeans, I think, maybe because of their history and what brought them to this country, the oppression and stuff that happened to them may have also influenced how they went about that. And there was this aura of the undiscussable. And so, as you know, a lot of my work looked for things that would take those things that are undiscussable, or take those things we've taken for granted, and put them out there and look at them. And look at them from different perspectives, because we can't get perspective on our own work or our own self without having other people show that back to us. And, you know, it was, in fact, the work around undiscussables that led me so strongly to Chris Ardress and Don Schoon. And, you know, honestly, I don't remember. I was trying to remember, when did I first pick up Donald Schoon and Ardress's work? I don't remember. I can't remember that moment. But I do know that by the time I was in graduate school, not my master's, but in terms of times I was at my doctoral work, that I had several colleagues, we were discussing Ardress and Schoen's work. So my work really is based in learning from experience, but taking a lens on it that says, how do we do this? And where are the problems that occur if we're not fully aware of what it is that means to us and what we're not aware of? And so I think a lot of the work, that's really the underlying piece that I work with. I still teach that. In the core of my teaching in the adult learning theory is we spend a lot of time on learning from experience, and we overlay things like self-directed learning and transformative learning and other perspectives on it. But ultimately, I'm still fascinated with what that's like. Yeah. I
mean, I see a kindred spirit here, and not everyone, even in the field, in say adult education, is as inherently and deeply fascinated with this question of experience. I feel they should be, but I sometimes go off and off in and deep down into this idea of things I find absolutely fascinating that kind of people don't find particularly problematic. And I love this phrase you just used of undiscussables. You know, there's all these other terms of people who've had these fascinations, the tacit, unconscious, unselfconscious, preconscious, all these type of questions. And I'm right there with you on finding that absolutely fascinating. And to go back even further, maybe I'll ask it as a question. The kind of milieu growing up in Cleveland, of being in a world of differences,
right,
and which immediately is only a hop, step and a jump away from the question of different experiences. I mean, I can see. Is that one of the kind of lessons you draw from that growing up experience and how it relates to you?
Absolutely. I mean, you could not, Cleveland, I don't know if it is now, but when I was growing up in it, like New York and like many other very large urban areas are, you know, you can't miss the differences, at least superficially, right? Because there are neighborhoods, and each neighborhood has its own particular character, et cetera. And Yeah, so I was very, very aware of that in not so much in my grade school days, because I went to walk to school just down the corner, and it was more or less, since we were in a Czechoslovakian, Slovakian, Slovenian neighborhood, that's who was there, right?
Mm,
But as you go to high school and then on to other areas, et cetera, this notion of, for example, right, I distinctly, all of us have a memory of the first time we came up against bias and discrimination, right? I mean, we all have an early childhood memory of that.
mhm,
And for me, it was that my grandmother, who I absolutely adored, and I spent a lot of time with her because my mother worked nights, my father worked days, and my grandmother lived upstairs and we lived downstairs, and we had a ball. We had a great time together. But I remember that there was a family down the street who was a Spanish family, and my grandmother said something very derogatory about "don't play with those sticks" or something like that.
mhm,
That just stuck in my mind.
mm,
What's the matter with these people? I like them a lot.
mhm,
What's the problem here, right? So I think that question of diversity of experience, their experiences are different than mine, and I mean, this just I encountered all the way through, and I'm still. That's a really important question in my work and my thinking is, what is the different interpretation that people have? What was their lived experience?
mhm,
It was magnified because I had the opportunity, as a young person, but not that young, out of out of out of school, out of college, really, to go to India and to live in India for a year and a half.
mm,
And so that just magnified it, right?
mhm.
I mean, the curiosity that everything that you can encounter in a situation where people are different from you are causes you to say, why did they do it that way? Why did they think that way? Why do I think that way? Why do I do it that way?
Mhm.
So absolutely fascinating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the world just bumping along, oftentimes without people even raising the question and reflecting on the question of someone might be in the room at the same time as me and experiencing things completely different. It's an undiscussable, unreflectable without some effort and supports, which brings us back a little bit to the idea of work and learning. We could talk all
Yes.
day about learning theory and the
Yes,
mind.
indeed.
Yeah,
Indeed.
but the work and learning question, I mean, these aren't for you. I would read it as these aren't very separable
Hmm.
in the sense when we admit that environment, culture,
Hmm. Yeah.
context matter, and learning in the workplace is a learning that's in a particular type of context that is
Hmm.
evolving as well. Do you see the workplace as evolving? I read that you do see it this
I
way,
do. Absolutely.
and its
Yeah.
effect on learning experience.
Hmm.
Maybe you could speak a little bit about what might be the things that linger in your mind as you continue to research these questions of context and learning in the workplace in terms
Right.
of your key themes,
Yeah.
perhaps the incidental and informal and undiscussables.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Those are all part of it. Uh, yeah, I think probably I became particularly aware of this because of the fact that I did work with UNICEF for about 4 or 5 years, and it was a wonderful experience. And you live in this multicultural bubble, really. And I did do a lot of work in learning and development and staff development and training with a wonderful Danish person who was in charge of this and who was very steeped in organizational psychology, group dynamics, all of those kinds of things. So in the workplace, the key thing, of course, is that there are certain constraints that are dictated by the work itself and by the context in which people are at. And so you cannot actually look at the learning that one would do without looking at how the context is influencing and interacting with the person and persons, because the context is sometimes people, it's something sometimes tangible, sometimes intangible. At the time that I was doing this work, I didn't actually know that there was the word situated, that situated learning. I discovered it later on,
Mm,
with actually Levin Wenger's original work in that area. But in the beginning, I grew up with Dewey in my own
mm,
educational background, so I've used Dewey and the constructivist perspective to process a lot of things. But it isn't really workplace learning. It is very situated. And if it becomes situated without inquiry or questioning into it, or awareness and kind of deep thought about it and looking at it and pulling it out, then it becomes confining because it's mindless. I mean, it's a habit. It becomes habitual, or it becomes socialization that is not thought about, but just done. And so there is that tension between, I really love the sociocultural theories and Vygotsky's work, et cetera. And I always wonder, where is the point where you need to bring in more of the notion that we also have to put that out there and ask questions about it, that we have to look into it, we have to think about it, and we can't do that on our own. We need to do that with the perspectives of other people. So that gets into, how do you create the environment for that, and who's there, and what's the group situation, what's the culture of the organization.
Yeah, students often ask, at least by the end of their, when they've really started to sort through and read across many different authors around this question of, whereas they would start a course or even a kind of a research project with this idea of, I want to look at unstructured learning, and they conflate informal, incidental with unstructured or utterly unstructured. And then as you get into, and we draw on Levenwinger as well, and others, but they start then turning that question upside down, where is there any situation that it doesn't have some sort of structure, in the sense of a cultural structure at the very least, as well as a physical structure sometimes. And so I've always associated your theory, or would you agree with me that your theory has always tried to seek these kind of unspoken, maybe getting into undiscussables again, structures and patterns of contexts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that is why I was very drawn, I think, when I discovered it, to action learning, because I discovered it in action learning is, of course, learning through work or through engagement in doing something. So, I mean, fundamentally, when I did discover Polanyi, when I read more of Polanyi itself, rather than just reading about him through Schoen or someone else, right? That the notion is that, in fact, you can't, it's not that we know things that we can't put into words. We don't know what we know until we act. And in the acting, we are knowing more, and we are engaging with whoever in the materials and the situation, the people around us, to know. It's an active kind of thing, and becoming more aware of that. So it's definitely what I found was so useful about action learning. And there are these different varieties of them, some of which are not highly inclined to do what I would like to do with it. So we do have, like, originally the GE model with Jack Welch. He didn't really want people to think too much about it. You know, he just wanted them to do things while they were, to learn more while they were doing things. But if you take an action learning model that has more focus on reflection and critical reflection and bringing things out, it's a laboratory in which, as things happen, you're stopping collectively, individually and collectively, to ask, what is this? You know, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Why are we calling it this way? Are there other ways to think about it? And so it is that bringing out the taken for granted and looking at it and feeling it and touching it and seeing what it might do, to be able to alternatively think in different ways. So definitely.
And workplaces that seem to make those opportunities and resources available systematically are ones that, would you associate them with the kind of emergence of learning-based work, as opposed like that thing I used in the introduction there, versus work-based learning?
Yeah, you can do it in work-based learning too. That was such a fun article to write, because Karen Watkins and Rachel and I, as we wrote it, it was Rachel's idea originally, this idea of learning-based work. And when she was in our doctoral program, and we were talking about all this stuff. And so we were trying to tease out these distinctions among work-based learning, and when does it become learning-based work, which it always was for some people, right? For doctors and for lawyers and for educators, hopefully, we don't know, but hopefully, if it's not learning-based work, it's probably not effective in one or other way, you know, except for things that are very routine and very habitual. But you know, if I look back to what I wrote originally and how I thought about things originally, some of those things that were just nascent at that time are just so much more prevalent now, right? I mean, it is like when we were starting to write about this, there were people who were working with non-routine situations where the organization gave them authorization to act on behalf of the organization on their own, because that was the only thing that could be done. But we know organizations are controlling, except probably these new ones coming up that are more self-managing, which are really interesting to watch because of the fact that you have to be seeing these dynamics coming about, because organizations by and large are set up to achieve something and either sell a product or do something. And so you can't just let everybody do whatever they want, or you wouldn't get anywhere. And so how do you do that? But organizations tend to want to control, in my experience, not all of them, but many of them. And so with that kind of situation, they want to control what that workplace environment is and how much freedom people have to really take that initiative on their own. And also organizations get into an ownership mentality, which I really don't like. Particularly in learning-based work, the recognition has to be that you're only as useful to the organization as you can continue to grow and learn, because nobody knows what's happening to the organization today or tomorrow, or maybe they don't even know what happened yesterday, actually. But, so if we don't have that slack in the system, and if we're not encouraged and supported to continuously learn, we're not that good to the organization when complex or chaotic situations arise, and we need a broader range of experience to draw upon to really make an educated guess about what we should be doing in the moment.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Well, it only makes sense. I mean, the alternative to what you describe only makes sense if we thought of the world as being static.
Yes.
And it's just, especially in certain sectors, and really in all sectors, but some are just pronounced in terms of the rapidity of change. You have to constantly be moving and have the capacities to learn and grow and develop, or else your organization isn't useful to the sector, and you're not useful to your organization, your team's not useful to your department, and so on, all that kind of stuff. Can I go back to something? Because do you know you know the name Richard Sennett?
Yes.
He wrote
I love Richard Sennett's work.
Oh, okay. See, there's another secret parallel in our lives, because I've read and reread some things, and I picked up that book he wrote called The Craftsmanship, or Craftsman, The Craftsman.
Yes.
And I fixated, and a little bit, you probably already have thought this through, but I've started to fixate on the way he describes alternative organizations of routine for craft or expert. I'll say more broadly expert. He talks about craft knowledge and things, but it's like routine generically might not be the enemy of advanced learning. It's more the organization of routine for, and I'm trying to bring this back to work-based learning. This that your student came up with, work-based learning versus learning-based work, and I haven't quite put my thumb on it perfectly yet, but there's something very different about the organization of routine in those two things. Just leveraging Sennett a bit. Does any of this ring?
Yeah, it does. And I'll go back and take a look at that. We've been looking at, my husband and I often talk about a lot of this stuff, and we've been working with two Italian people, Francesca Bracci and Alessandro Romano, both of whom were doctoral students who came over and spent some time with me, and I was on their committees, and I just kept working with them. And you may know Sylvia Girardi's work on practice-based learning, right? Not practice-based learning, but practice studies, right? And I've just gotten very interested in that whole area in working with them, partly because Francesca, for a consulting assignment, they're both of them are academics right now, but they do work with organizations. I find in Italy, the universities are useful to people's lives. Whereas in the United States, the workplaces and stuff, they think, oh, I'm not going to get those people involved. They won't be able to help me, but they have gone into organizations. So she did a very interesting study with a group that did leather bags, very high-end leather bags, in which the problem that they were facing was that it was a community of practice kind of apprenticeship mode. And the older people didn't trust the younger people to be able to take in and and take that precious commodity that they had crafted and worked with all their lives and revere it and work with it in the way that they felt that it needed to be done to preserve it and to sustain it. And, because young people have different ideas when they come into settings, but the young people felt they weren't getting any slack to do that. So it was like one of those conflict, those dual things that are feeding one another dysfunctionally. Anyway, she studied this and worked with them and applied this practice-based lens to it. So I just love that idea that, which I think is in Sennett also, and they compare Sennett, and they compare the practice-based studies in Sylvia Girardi's work around this, that it creates in some ways that practices, there are practices that become habitual and mindless. And those are often the ones that the organization institutes, like you must do after action reviews. As soon as you say that, the after action review becomes useless. And I think the reason, I want to come back to this whole question of what they're doing there, but the reason why I think it becomes useless is because many people who are in learning-based work and even work-based learning are intrinsically motivated. They're not extrinsically motivated. Extrinsic motivation requires regulation and financial rewards and extrinsic rewards. Internal motivation gets killed by them. And so as soon as you say you must do an after-action review, people do it and check the box, but they don't do it. They gain nothing from it, right? Very little anyway. So she, in their work with this organization, this craft-based organization, they were looking at differences between routine work that has become mindless versus thoughtfully engaged, infused work, for which there probably are some orders and some sequences and some good things, but they can't be just mindlessly applied because every situation you encounter is different. And so, do you know Erout's work? He's done a lot on informal learning in England.
Yeah, no, he was one of my people on my list for this Foundational Voices series, and I haven't got around to reaching out. Is he still with us?
He's not with us now, which is really a shame. Yeah,
I'm glad I asked.
Yeah, his work is so. I go back to it a lot, and he talked about the fact that one of the things that educational institutions or training doesn't do well in preparing people for is to look at pattern recognition in a mindful way, that their people aren't able to diagnose for themselves or for other situations necessarily, what is the pattern here and what is it that what am I recognizing or not? And so you'll know in our informal incidental learning cycle that first step of interrogating the situation and trying to understand it is really that step of getting smarter about what do I know, what do I don't know, what's routine, what's not routine, what do I have to adapt, what can I just do because I know this is going to probably work pretty well, or to watch it, but so I think, I don't know, does that help you? I mean, does that ring any bells? Because I think that's they compare too, this Sennett's view as well as this other view of practice-based studies.
Yeah, no, I think you kind of made a place that I recognize quite directly for in one of your classic models in a way I hadn't thought about it when I asked the question. So that makes perfect sense to me. Yeah, I'm struck in your work on this question that I'm about to ask you. I've been struck, like, not everyone continuously either does or appears to do read so widely as you do. There's a whole, I don't know what percentage it would be of intellectuals who stay very much in their neighborhood.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Cleveland all of a sudden again here.
Cleveland, right?
Stay in their neighborhood.
Right, exactly. Right.
And they don't really read across things. But you're one of the not a huge number of people in the field of work, learning, research, who just seems. I'll ask you. You just seem constantly on the search for ideas, and I could never say, wow, she's just staying in a neighborhood here, because you talk about Dewey and you're inspired by Argus and Sean, and you talk about Mesereau, you mentioned Erod, you're familiar with Senate. I could probably start listing things and you go, yeah, I looked at that. Lev and Wenger. Are these continuing inspirations, and you attempt then to kind of use them constructively in your own way? What other inspirations are there? And are there core inspirations to your work that have remained in terms of authors?
Yeah, that is such a good question. I do tend to, it's probably, I think, because I'm an introvert. I don't know, extroverts are always looking for the next best thing, or that's probably a misdiagnosis of extroverts, but they're always talking up new things. And actually, I think I pick up a lot of my interests in different things by listening to extroverts talking, because they point me in directions that I need to do, need to explore, etc. But yeah, there are continuing people, and I was thinking about that last night. What are some of the continuing people? And I don't think I'd abandon Dewey. My colleague Aliki Nicolaitis, who's at Georgia with Karen, and who's a graduate of our program, she has just been reinterpreting Dewey. And Tom James, who was our provost before the one that's just been here, he's a Dewey scholar. He's still at the college, and she had come to the college, and she and he had a long conversation, and he introduced her to this rethinking of some of the work that Dewey has had around what it means to learn from experience. It's like the people who have translated Vygotsky and those who argue that the translation was wrong because they missed the essence of something. And it's like the idea you said earlier, that we all have these experiences and we interpret them differently, because we interpret through our own lens, right? But Dewey too, I think there's still so much richness in there. And I like to go back to things that he writes. My favorite book of Mesereau's is the first one that he wrote on transformative learning, the transformative dimensions of adult learning. And since I teach the class and I work with it, I always go back and I said, such a pleasure. I said, wow, I didn't know he said that. So I think Dewey, Argerson, Schoen, Dewey, Argerson, Schoen, Mesereau. I didn't get into all, and Schoen, Donald Schoen. Because when I say Argerson Schoen, I think that's a lot of that work is dominated by Argers.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah. Whereas Schoen, now I'm really interested. We have that book around here, and I know I've seen it recently. I want to go and read his Beyond the Stable State, which is, because I'm reading, it's very interesting. He looked at this area of complexity, and I'm reading this book that I ran into by other people. You may have run into it, called Design Unbound. Have you run into that?
That rings a bell. I've definitely not read it though. So,
well, I'm just reading it. I've had it for over a year, but and I've dipped into it, but now I'm reading it, more systematically, because she is an architect. Like Schoen has philosophical background also, but she's an architect, and Schoen, of course, used the example of architecture in his Educating the Reflective Practitioner book. And as she goes through and looks at how the fundamental paradigms through which we interpret things have shifted, from logical and linear ones to very complex ones. And she has some fascinating work around that area. And as she does that, she shows why, for example, Karen and I talk a lot about context, but Aliki has said, when you talk about context, the way it sounds more of a barrier or constraint, but not a player. And in complexity work, context is part of the whole thing. It's part of the player, because everything is affected by unpredictability. And they talk about context, she does, and she being Ann Pendleton Julian, who wrote this with John Seeley Brown. But as an architect, she talks about what that means and how you use, she says, you use the imagination muscle to an abductive reasoning. I've always been an inductive reasoning person, because you asked me about my research, I'm more in the qualitative mode and I'm more inductive. But she points to abductive reasoning, which design people in architecture use a lot. Anyway, she points out that Shun did do a lot of work around, for example, reframing the context. But his ideas of the context as presented, maybe not how he really thought, but what got written on paper in the context of the way that worked in architecture, had more to do with position A and position B. It had to do more with one frame and reframe that seems to satisfy as many possible apparent needs through the problem diagnosis that one has. Whereas what she's saying in complexity is that we really need to be pushing ourselves to keep a lot of avenues of inquiry open, and it's reframing constantly that we need to do, which strikes me as really important and very interesting when you ask them, so what does informal and incidental learning look like if it's constant reframing, right?
Well, framing has always been a big part of your theory from the beginning. So I could see this kind of deepening, and then if I'm following you correctly, and then adding a kind of a different type of interpretation about context. Like your phrasing was context as player.
Yeah.
I find that really fascinating. I mean, my original background and training was in sociology, and I think of things of social, like social facts and social actors, but also social agents can be kind of, individuals, but they're not limited to individuals. They can be organizations, institutions, societies, whatever. So it has this flexible usage of agent.
Yes.
It can be a collective agent, a social agent, so on and so forth. And I could imagine context being thought of more as a larger collective agent, at least in analysis than most, heck, even Levin Wenger talked about.
Right, right. I mean, think about it in terms of, Karen and I do a lot of work with culture and climate, and think about that as a player, because it is, right? I mean, it's like we have dance partners, and some of them we know about and some we don't, right?
Yeah,
and one of our dance partners is definitely the culture, because we're always checking consciously or unconsciously what is against what we think it is. And we may not be doing consciously, but the culture is a large part of that, because it carries a lot of these expectations and norms that are there in the woodwork.
Yeah, and the Deweyan distinction between nature and experience, and how experience and culture seem to be cousins or identical, maybe, I don't know, depends on who you're talking to. And then nature, there's an interesting set of questions that can be pursued using a Deweyan framework. Anyways, not to make it all.
No, it's very, very interesting. I know Aliki would be fascinated by this conversation too, because she's gotten very much into rethinking of aspects of Dewey around generativity.
You're right. I gotta read this person. I'll follow up with you after this. You seem naturally given to a kind of an openness of willingness to just explore, and I think that stems or is reflective of what I argued to you before, that you have a broad reading, a kind of a persistence and constant, a willingness to read and interpret and see what something has to say. Are there things that you have? This is a question I think I included in my pre-questions I would have sent to you. Things, either methodologies or theories, you've kind of almost started to do one here, or I don't know, some other aspect of work learning research that you've always had in the back of your mind you might like to do, and you thought might have some potential, but you've never gotten around to doing it. You may never, who knows, whatever. This is something we're often not asked. What have you not gotten to yet that you kind of have in the back of your mind you might want to get to?
Yeah, well, there are a number of things, as you can imagine. I'm sure you have a bunch of them too. I have a bookshelf with some of them.
Right.
But one of them is, in fact, this work which I encountered on Design Unbound, because Karen and I are doing what we've done is taken up. We did write with Aliki and with another colleague, Ellen Scully Russ, to kind of update informal learning for the New Directions a few years ago, and they have been bringing the lenses of Vygotsky and complexity more to it. And so we have a project group, a collaborative actually, that are looking at what does complexity do to informal and incidental learning in different situations?
Mm.
And each of us is looking at it in a different kind of situation or context. I'm happen to be looking at it with the medical MDs, because we have some MDs in our program, and we're looking at we've done a study. Karen's involved in it too, of a small number of emergency room doctors and ICU doctors telling stories of their experience of learning in relationship to COVID in the first couple of months when they experienced it. Because that's a complex situation if you ever had one, right?
Yeah. Rapidly evolving.
Rapidly. And, you know, some of these things we were talking about are in play here. I know I'm going to get to the thing about the other people, but because you see the tension of the medical doctors in needing to explore other alternatives, because they can't just rely on evidence-based knowledge that exists from the past. Their discomfort around it, but also you can see the structure and the culture of the medical and healthcare environment weighing in. I don't think they completely think about it, because some of them were doing really interesting things, but it got checked a bit by, we can't do that here, you know. And of course it also is that we should do no harm, and we're playing around with things we don't really know about, and this could kill people. You know, so there are a bunch of things involved. But I think this player of the culture and the norms, you know, is a big piece of that. Anyway, so the Design Unbound, I think, is really, the work that she's doing is really breakthrough in a lot of ways, and it really is important to do. So we're looking at that a lot. But I'm also, I don't know if you've run into the I'd like to do more with the Engstrom stuff. And I've also following, you know, indirectly, not made any personal contact with, but interested in some of the work that's being done in Finland there around things like, they call it trialogic learning. And, you know, inspired, I think, by a lot of the technology, because AI is here, right? So learning with machines and how we partner with them. And as George Siemens asks, you know, what's distinctly human about what we do versus what machines do? These are areas that I have not definitely done enough in, but I feel like it overlaps. Lingering, and it overlaps a bit with the question you asked about what would I advise new researchers or new doctoral students, because I think you can't, whether you like technology or not, you can't not understand it.
Right.
And getting into it and really messing around with it, which I don't really have the time to do right now, given other things that I'm balancing, etc. But even if you're not terribly interested in technology and you're very humanistic, etc., it's like you can't miss, you must know that in the bones. You have to know it in the bones, because it is really where so much is going to be happening at work.
Well, this is this has been a theme that you foresaw quite some time ago about technological change, more so than a lot of the people. I mean, of course, there are people devoted to looking at tech change in work and to some degree learning. The learning aspect is probably impoverished amongst those folks, but they really have the tech stuff over many decades. But now, I mean, this question of AI mediated systems, you brought that idea of context as player or culture as player. Well, with AI involved, that's culture as player or context as player on steroids.
Exactly.
Like it's an active player.
Right. And an intelligent one.
Of a type. Yeah, sure. And we're bumping into that exact question in the exact manner that you kind of just started to allude to. Well, to speak to, with a graduate student of mine. We're studying platform economics. And it's a kind of a bit of a subfield in a way right now, but it is all very technologically informed and driven. But many of it has it. Many of the scholars have this. They put it in direct contact with some, political economic thought, nature of capitalism and things of that nature. And then we try to bring it right into and we're not there yet, but this is a lingering thing that's kind of on the doorstep. Is to look at a robust kind of learning appreciation of these dynamics. which
Yeah.
isn't quite there yet, at least in the area of that little corner of the neighborhood, which is kind of platform economics. If that was a key search term, you'd find this little cluster of people
Yeah.
who talk to each other around that stuff. Anyways, I feel like I totally took you off.
Oh, no, you didn't, because it's a lot of these areas, like I have a student who was he's not in our program, he's in the technology program, but he was in my research design class, my introductory qualitative research design class in the spring. And what he did was he designed a game, a simple game for a pilot study, in which he had he was playing with the idea of choice and choices people make. And so he had a game set up in which certain things happened and didn't happen, and he was looking at exploring this idea. But this whole area of gaming and technology and what that means for learning, Karen has a doctoral student she's working with. Who is set up a whole game in which she's exploring. She was trying to develop a rough measure for incidental learning, and she did it by having people playing games and all this stuff. And I have another student who's looking at creating a game where people can actually go in and change the rules of the game rather than play by the rules of the game, to see who does or doesn't do that, and why or why not do they change the rules of the game. How conscious are they of the fact that they're playing by somebody else's rules and choices for them? So I think that we're here, we are here, and we can't, I only can step in certain ways, but if I were a younger person, I would do a lot more in becoming more aware and knowledgeable of all of the different technologies needed to make more direct study of that area.
Fundamental questions about learning theory vis-a-vis this gaming methodology.
Oh,
and,
yes.
and single and double loop learning, right
Yes,
there in front of you.
Right there.
And the data is being generated.
Yeah, exactly.
That's amazing.
Right.
Well, I'm conscious a little bit of the time and your generosity, and I want to ask you this final question, which I take really seriously, that you would have seen it, and you started actually to speak about advice to graduate student researchers in the area of work and learning, broadly conceived, or just new researchers, or researchers new to the field, even if they're experienced researchers elsewhere, but are kind of migrating over. Do you have some advice you could share? I mean, especially with doctoral students, but.
It's a very interesting question, and it is an important one. I think that one thing, if we go back to learning from experience, is to really, people need to have experience in the workplace. Sometimes I think people are so wanting to move so quickly in whatever area they happen to choose that they want to skip the thing about spending several years working in an organization, right? I still think that's very important. If you want to be writing about workplace learning and you haven't experienced it yourself, I don't think you can easily do it. I think for me, it's been invaluable without really consciously thinking about it, but the experience of living in an organization just sensitizes you to certain things that otherwise you might not be sensitized to. And so I think getting that experience, not just to check it off in your resume, but to use it, right? To use it to feed your thinking and to feed your reading and your thoughtfulness about it. And then I don't know, with research methods, it really does depend on people. I mean, there are people whose minds work more in quantitative methods, mine does not. So I don't go there. I have done work with people and I appreciate what quantitative methods bring, but I really salivate over the qualitative work. So that's where I have really spent my time. I was very fortunate in large part because of Jack Mesereau's introduction to Anselm Strauss to study with Strauss and Glaser for a couple of years.
Wow.
That was really amazing at University of California, Berkeley. After I'd done a lot of work in Asia, I went back to graduate school for my doctorate. And Jack said, well, he had been there at California for a while. He introduced me to Anselm, and they were at the University of California Medical School across in San Francisco. And I just commuted over. They had a 2-year seminar. I just joined it. And that's where I got my training for research. And I'm just grateful because it was just an amazing experience. So one thing I didn't do in doctoral work that people advised me to do, and I said, no, I'm not interested, was do more quantitative studies and research methods, because you have to at least understand them, even if you don't want to play in that field. I understand them, but I don't pay enough attention to them because I'm less interested in what they have to tell me. I'd rather work at that other level. But I think that there's very exciting areas to explore now. So don't confine yourself to the areas that somebody tells you should do, but find things you're really excited about and curious about and really move forward with them. Wayne Pace, did you ever know Wayne Pace? He was in Utah. He was at the, I don't think he's with us anymore. He was big in the field of communication studies, really, but was a big founder of the human resource development area. And one time I was at a conference early on. I am been very involved with Reg Revens and with the action learning work for some time. And a group of us were trying to figure out how to get money to study this stuff. And Wayne looked at us and laughed, and he said, if you only go where the money is, you're going to ruin your career. You're going to study whatever is out there there's money in, and you won't have any thread of interest, and you won't be interested in it. So go where you're interested. And if the money comes, that's great. But that's where what really drives your development is going where you're interested in. So there are many interesting challenges out there. We can all pick something that's of great interest to us and pursue it. So I would do that.
Well, it doesn't take much for me to imagine there's a direct linkage between that last point you made and the distinction between work-based learning and learning-based work.
That's right. Yeah.
And it's a great place to end. That's a lot of great advice. I really like all the points, but the need for really embedding yourself in a context so that you can understand some of the undiscussables. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure and a joy to get to know your work more. And I'm sure we're going to have more conversations about Senate, among others.
Yeah, I would love to stay in touch. So I want to formally say thank you at the end of this. I just think it's invaluable for people, and because different information somehow burbles through when someone speaks in an informal context like this. And the tangents are where the gold is sometimes. And I feel like we mined some together today. And anyways, I just want to thank you for your contribution. And I guess just formally say goodbye, if that's okay.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me and having me. And it's really been a pleasure. So
yeah, me too. Me too.
I won't say goodbye. I'll say till the next time.
Okay, yeah, right. There's a distinction there. You're right. Yeah, until the next time. Okay. Okay, take it easy.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.